It started with a question no one wanted to answer. The air in room 213 was thick with boredom and the faint smell of dry erase markers. The ticking wall clock sounded louder than it had any right to. Mr. Reynolds tapped the board with the back of his marker cap, trying, and failing, to spark interest. "Anyone?" he asked, pointing to the quadratic equation scrawled across the whiteboard. "Come on, this is basic stuff." The class shrank in their chairs, avoiding eye contact like it might give them homework. Elijah Carter sat in the back corner, bent over his desk, his pencil dancing across the edge of his notebook, but not on the problem. He was lost in something else entirely. Mr. Reynolds noticed. "Mr. Carter," he called, tone half patient, half annoyed. "Care to rejoin the rest of us?" Elijah didn't look up. His hands were working quickly, sketching arcs and curves that looped and folded in on themselves like waves in a storm. His desk looked less like math class and more like an architect's sketchpad. "Elijah," Mr. Reynolds said again, louder now. "Since you're clearly working on a thesis back there, why don't you come show us what's more important than solving for X?" The class turned. Elijah blinked, startled, then slowly rose from his chair. He clutched his notebook tight as he walked to the front, not defiantly, not nervously either, just calm, like he'd done this 100 times in his head. He took the marker without a word, faced the board, and began to draw. First, he made a spiral, expanding outward in precise, perfect proportion, a golden ratio, smooth and hypnotic. Then came the angles, intersecting lines, arcs that sliced through the spiral like waves, like breath, like movement. It wasn't random. It wasn't art for art's sake. There was intention. Pattern. A deeper rhythm. For a moment, the room was dead quiet. Elijah stepped back, wiped his hand on his jeans, and turned to face the class. His voice was soft, but steady. "This is what numbers look like when they're alive," he said. "It's the same pattern in pine cones, in seashells, hurricanes. Even galaxies. It shows up everywhere. You just have to see it." He looked directly at Mr. Reynolds then, eyes wide open, unblinking. "Math isn't just answers. It's design." And that's when the laugh came. It started slow, a breathy chuckle from Mr. Reynolds' chest, then burst into a full-blown, sharp, echoing laugh that bounced off the tile floor and back into Elijah's bones. "You're serious?" he said, wiping a tear from his eye. "Kid, this is algebra, not science fiction. What you've got here is doodling with delusions of grandeur." A few students laughed, too. Some just smiled awkwardly. Others looked at Elijah like he was a kid who brought a toy to a gunfight. Elijah didn't flinch. He just lowered the marker, capped it, and returned to his seat, notebook pressed to his chest like armor. Mr. Reynolds kept talking. Something about focus, about respecting the curriculum. But Elijah didn't hear it. Not really. All he could hear was that laugh. That damn laugh. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? By the time the bell rang, Elijah had stopped trying to pretend he was listening. He collected his things, kept his head down, and moved through the hallway like a ghost. Whispers followed him. Words like weird, obsessed, and try hard slid off lockers and walls. He didn't stop walking. Outside, the air was cold and biting, and the wind tugged at the edges of his hoodie. Elijah took the long way home, the route that looped behind the school, past the rundown basketball courts and the chain-link fences that rattled like bones in the breeze. His sneakers crunched gravel as he walked. He knew no one would be home. His mom was on her second double shift this week. Nurse. Overworked. Underpaid. Elijah loved her more than anything, but she didn't understand him. Not really. Not the numbers. Not the spirals. Not how they made him feel less alone. He let himself into the apartment, dropped his bag by the door, and flicked on the hallway light. It buzzed, then blinked. Half dead. In his bedroom, he sat cross-legged on the floor, notebook in his lap, pencil already tracing lines. Not for a grade. Not for approval. For air. For peace. He flipped back through the pages, sketches of fractals, number sequences, waveform structures, weird little maps that made no sense to anyone but him. But they did make sense. Because to Elijah, numbers didn't lie. People lied. People left. People laughed. Numbers never did. He thought back to the way Mr. Reynolds laughed, loud and full of certainty. Like someone who'd already decided the world had nothing left to teach him. Elijah didn't want to be like that. He didn't want to stop being surprised. He turned to a clean page and wrote one sentence at the top in careful, block letters. Some truths aren't meant to be explained. They're meant to be seen. And then, he drew. This time, slower. A shape emerged, a spiral with mirrored curves, intersecting with a line that bent upward, like a heartbeat. At the end of the curve, he wrote a single number. 1.618. He didn't need to label it. He already knew. The golden ratio. Phi. Nature's favorite number. Elijah smiled, not because anyone else understood, but because he did. Outside, the streetlights flickered on one by one. The city breathed its usual song of sirens and wind and television static through apartment windows. Elijah didn't notice. He was already somewhere else. Inside the sequence, inside the rhythm. Inside the place where no one could laugh at him, because the numbers were still speaking. And he was still listening. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The first time Elijah Carter realized the world didn't make sense, he was 6 years old and sitting on the apartment floor, staring at the front door that never opened. It had been 3 days since his father left. No note. No warning. Just a half-empty dresser and the ghost of a goodbye. His mom told him it wasn't his fault, that sometimes grown-ups broke in ways you couldn't fix, but Elijah didn't believe that. Not really. He believed in patterns. And that day, the pattern shattered. After that, he started counting things. At first, it was just footsteps, his mother's heels clicking across the kitchen linoleum. Then it was the seconds between microwave beeps. Then cracks in the ceiling. Then the numbers on price tags at the corner store when they couldn't afford both milk and cereal. The numbers were quiet. They didn't shout. They didn't lie. And most importantly, they didn't leave. By the time he was 9, Elijah had filled 3 spiral notebooks with number sequences he found in nature, on bus tickets, in shadows. He saw symmetry where others saw mess. He could calculate the pattern of leaves on a branch before most kids finished learning long division. His mom called it a gift, but said it quietly, like she was afraid someone might take it away. She worked nights at the hospital, long shifts where she came home with aching feet and dark circles under her eyes. Elijah learned to cook eggs on his own, keep the TV low, and never ask for too much. Instead, he asked the numbers questions. And somehow, they always answered. At school, it was different. They didn't know what to make of him. Some teachers called him advanced. Others said distracted. Most said nothing at all. He didn't act out. He didn't fight or scream. But he also didn't join in. At recess, he sat alone on the far bench, scribbling equations and curve diagrams. Kids called him weird behind his back, sometimes to his face. Elijah didn't flinch. He just wrote. He didn't need their words. He had formulas. But the noise still got in sometimes, especially when it came from adults. Like Mr. Reynolds. The memory of the laugh still echoed in his head days later. Not the laugh itself, but the meaning behind it, the cold dismissal, the disbelief that something so beautiful could come from someone like him. He wasn't naive. He knew how people saw him, a quiet black kid from a low-income zip code with no father and no future. They expected him to fit a mold, and when he didn't, they didn't know what to do with him. He sat on the fire escape that Friday night, legs dangling over cold metal, staring out at the city's glow. His notebook rested on his knees, open to a page of flowing curves and hidden equations. The buildings looked like binary from up here. Windows lit or dark, ones and zeros stacked high. Somewhere below, a siren wailed. A man shouted. A car backfired. The city spoke in noise, but Elijah tuned it out. He was searching for something quieter. Something true. Inside, the apartment hummed with the low whir of the fridge. The couch still had a tear in the cushion from when he was 8 and tried to make a rocket launcher out of PVC pipes. His mom had never fixed it, not because she didn't care, but because she always had more important things to fix. Like bills. Like exhaustion. When she got home that night, keys jingling like wind chimes in the lock, Elijah was already back at the kitchen table, math textbook open, not because he needed it, but because he knew she'd ask. "Homework," she said, dropping her purse onto the chair with a sigh. He nodded. "Yeah. Just finishing." She leaned down and kissed the top of his head. Her lips were cold. "You're my little genius," she said, the way she always did. But tonight, it sounded more like a prayer than a compliment. "Mom," Elijah asked, not looking up, "do you think I'm too different?" She paused. "Different how?" "Just, not like other kids." She took a deep breath, sat across from him. "Baby, you were never meant to be like other kids. That's not a curse. That's your gift. But what if no one sees it that way?" She reached across the table and laid her hand on his. Her fingers were calloused, nails short, skin dry from sanitizer. "Then you make them see." He wanted to believe her. He really did. But at school, different wasn't admired. It was tolerated, until it wasn't. And that laugh from Mr. Reynolds had made something in him crack open. Not just because it was cruel, but because for a split second, he believed it. That maybe all of this, the spirals, the sequences, the silent patterns, really was just nonsense. He closed his textbook. Went to his room. Locked the door. And opened his notebook. Tonight, he didn't draw spirals. He drew noise. Waves of it. He sketched out the hum of fluorescent lights, the sharp drop of laughter, the flat line of silence that always came after. Then he began breaking them down. Converting sound to numbers. Mapping chaos. There had to be structure underneath. Elijah spent hours like that, not lost, but found. In every calculation, he built armor. In every equation, he found a piece of himself the world hadn't touched yet. When the sun rose the next morning, soft and gold through the blinds, his notebook had a new title scribbled across the top of a fresh page. The Architecture of Sound. And underneath, in neat block letters. Every noise has an origin. Every origin has a shape. And shape is just math in disguise. He didn't know yet what he would do with it. But he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let someone else's laugh drown out the only voice that had never lied to him, the one made of numbers. Elijah sat in the back of the classroom, eyes fixed on the clock. Each tick echoed in his mind like a countdown, pulling him deeper into the numbers. He wasn't sure if it was the tick-tock of the clock or the hum of the fluorescent lights above, but all he could think about was patterns. Numbers. Sequences. Anything that could make the world feel less chaotic. It was Friday, and Mr. Reynolds was standing at the front of the room, droning on about quadratic equations. Elijah had already solved the problems in his head before the teacher even finished writing them on the board. But he didn't say anything. He never did. He kept his head down, fingers tapping a rhythm on his notebook as he traced the shape of a perfect triangle. He was good at math, better than anyone in the class, but that was exactly why it hurt. No one cared. They didn't notice how quickly he solved equations, how effortlessly his mind bent numbers into neat lines. To them, Elijah was just the quiet black kid in the back of the room, the one who barely spoke, the one who couldn't blend in. It wasn't just the kids in his class. It was Mr. Reynolds, too. The way he'd laughed the other day when Elijah had shared his fascination with numbers. "You're not gonna make it far with just numbers, Elijah," the teacher had said, shaking his head with a half-smirk. It wasn't the first time Elijah had heard that. "Numbers aren't everything," they said. "You've got to have a plan for life." But Elijah didn't know what that meant. Numbers were his plan. They were the only thing that made sense to him. They didn't judge. They didn't leave. But no one else seemed to get it. "Hey, Elijah." A voice yanked him out of his thoughts. He looked up to see Jason, a lanky kid with a loud laugh and a group of friends who made fun of anything that wasn't normal. Jason had that look on his face, the one that told Elijah he was about to be the joke of the day. Elijah straightened up in his seat, but didn't speak. He knew what was coming. "Mr. Genius over here," Jason said loudly, nudging his friend Mark. "How many times can you divide your head into little pieces before you finally understand that life isn't all about math?" Mark chuckled. "Yeah, maybe he's too busy counting his way to nowhere." The others around them laughed, some of them nervously glancing at Elijah, others finding the whole thing hilarious. He could feel their eyes on him, the curious stares, the whispers. He was used to it, but that didn't make it any easier. He dropped his eyes back to his notebook, his hand hovering over the page, where he had started drawing a spiral of prime numbers. He didn't want to say anything. He couldn't. But a part of him longed to show them, to show Mr. Reynolds, to show the entire class, what was inside his head. If only they could see the beauty of the numbers, the way they danced for him in his mind. But it wasn't enough to be brilliant. It wasn't enough to be different. Not if no one understood. The bell rang, and the class filed out, a blur of voices and backpacks. Elijah gathered his things slowly, the weight of the laughter still pressing down on his chest. He didn't make eye contact with anyone as he shoved his notebook into his bag and stood up. But as he turned to leave, Mr. Reynolds' voice stopped him. "Elijah," Mr. Reynolds called, his tone stern. "Can you stay a minute?" Elijah hesitated. A chill ran down his spine. He didn't know what this was about, but he had a sinking feeling that it wasn't going to be good. He stood still for a moment, then nodded, walking to the front of the classroom, his heart pounding in his chest. The other kids were already gone, laughing and chatting as they left for lunch or their next class, leaving Elijah alone with the teacher. Mr. Reynolds didn't immediately look at him. Instead, he was scribbling something on the board, the chalk screeching as he wrote. Elijah felt his throat tighten. His palms grew sweaty. He couldn't help but wonder if this was going to be a lecture, or worse, a reprimand for being different. Finally, Mr. Reynolds turned around. His glasses were perched low on his nose, and his lips were pressed into a tight line. "Elijah, you're a smart kid. I'll give you that. But I'm not sure what you're trying to prove by sitting in the back of the class and drawing all over your notebooks." Elijah blinked, feeling the sting of Mr. Reynolds' words. "I'm not trying to prove anything," he said quietly, though the words didn't feel right. He didn't know how to explain that he wasn't drawing. He was solving. He was seeing things that no one else could. Mr. Reynolds took off his glasses and sighed. "Look, Elijah, you're obviously gifted. But you can't just hide in the numbers. You need to learn how to interact with the world. You can't live in a bubble." Elijah's chest tightened. "I'm not hiding," he said, his voice rising a little, though he couldn't explain why it felt so important. I I just see things in a way you don't understand. And it helps. Mr. Reynolds didn't respond right away. He seemed to be weighing Elijah's words carefully, but there was something in his eyes, something that made Elijah feel small. You know, I've been teaching for over 15 years, Mr. Reynolds said, his voice softening, but only a little. And I've never seen a student who's so obsessed with nothing. The word stung, but it was the way he said it that hurt more. Like it wasn't worth anything. Like Elijah wasn't worth anything. I'm not obsessed with nothing, Elijah whispered, his hands trembling now, the anger rising in him. Numbers are everything. They make sense of all the chaos. Mr. Reynolds shook his head. I'm going to need you to think about your future, Elijah. This obsession with numbers, it's going to hold you back. The bell rang again, this time louder, like an escape. Elijah couldn't stand another second in that room. He turned sharply, grabbed his bag, and bolted for the door, ignoring Mr. Reynolds' calls to slow down. Outside, the world was loud again. Voices. Cars honking. The normal noise of the city. But all Elijah could hear was the echo of Mr. Reynolds' words, the sting of the laugh, and the feeling that no one, not even the teacher, would ever understand the world inside his head. As he walked down the hall, he promised himself one thing: he wasn't going to let it stop him. Not now, not ever. He wasn't like them. And he didn't want to be. The days that followed felt like a blur. Elijah's mind was consumed by numbers, by patterns, by the swirling vortex of equations and symbols that filled the corners of his brain. It was as though the world outside him didn't exist. Every time he tried to focus on the things around him, his friends, the schoolwork that wasn't math-related, the way people treated him, he found himself sinking back into his thoughts, the numbers pulling him further away from everything else. It was the first Saturday after the argument with Mr. Reynolds that he decided to do something different. He couldn't keep feeling like this, trapped in a world no one seemed to understand. He needed to get out, to see something new, to find a way to push past the boundaries that were closing in on him. Elijah walked into the city, his shoes hitting the concrete rhythmically, the weight of the city's noise pushing against his senses. The world seemed too loud, too chaotic, as if it were mocking him. But there was something else that called to him. He'd always known it existed, but he had never had the courage to face it. The library. His footsteps quickened as he approached the large, imposing building. The old, historic library stood tall and silent against the chaos of the world. Its massive wooden doors opened easily as Elijah entered, greeted by the scent of old books and the quiet hum of fluorescent lights. He felt a strange peace here, a place where numbers and logic were revered, and where everything seemed to make sense. He wandered through the aisles, fingers trailing along the spines of books, mathematics, physics, history, each one a door to something bigger than he had ever imagined. But it wasn't enough. There was something missing, something that hadn't clicked in his mind yet. He knew that Mr. Reynolds had been right about one thing: Elijah couldn't keep hiding in his numbers. But he didn't know how to step out of that world without losing what made him who he was. At the back of the library, Elijah stumbled upon a small section of books that didn't quite fit in with the rest. They were tucked away on a shelf covered in dust, their titles written in fading gold letters. He pulled one from the shelf, blowing the dust off the cover. It was a book about patterns in nature. It seemed like an odd choice for a kid who loved strict math and numbers. But something about the title intrigued him. The Beauty of Chaos: How Numbers Shape Nature. Elijah sank into one of the cozy chairs in the corner and began to read. The book explained how math wasn't just a set of rules to follow, but a force that existed all around them. The spirals in sunflower seeds. The Fibonacci sequence in pine cones. The perfect symmetry of a snowflake. The numbers weren't just on paper. They were alive, breathing, moving through everything, from the stars in the sky to the oceans that stretched out across the planet. For the first time, Elijah felt something shift inside him. This wasn't what he had expected. It wasn't just about solving equations or memorizing theorems. It was about understanding the world, about connecting the dots between the visible and the invisible, between the things he knew and the things he didn't yet understand. The book spoke of patterns in chaos, how even the most unpredictable things in the universe followed certain laws, how randomness could give birth to something incredibly beautiful. Elijah's fingers hovered over the page, his heart racing. He'd been missing something all along. This wasn't just about the numbers. This was about seeing how the numbers were connected to everything else, how they were woven into the very fabric of life itself. He spent hours at the library, flipping through books, reading about mathematical theories, fractals, chaos theory, and the connection between mathematics and the natural world. But the more he learned, the more he felt the weight of the world pressing on him. The feeling that he didn't belong, that he was just a puzzle piece no one could fit into, kept gnawing at him. When he finally left the library, the sun was low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the streets. The world felt different now, lighter somehow, but also more complex. Elijah walked home slowly, trying to process everything he had just learned. There were so many things that he didn't know, so many new concepts that danced in his mind. But for the first time, the numbers didn't feel like a barrier. They felt like a bridge. He arrived home and sat down at his desk, surrounded by his notebooks filled with equations, sketches of spirals, and carefully constructed patterns. He pulled out a fresh page of paper and began to draw. He drew a spiral, and then another, and another. They intertwined, creating something beautiful. The numbers were no longer just about the calculations or the formulas. They were becoming a language, a way of understanding the world in its entirety. The more he drew, the more he realized how much of the world around him was shaped by the very things he loved. It was all connected. Elijah lost track of time. The evening sun sank lower, and the shadows in his room grew longer. But he didn't care. He was no longer trapped in his mind. The numbers were freeing him. As he continued to draw, he heard a knock on the door. "Elijah? You home?" It was his mom's voice, soft and concerned. Elijah quickly wiped the page of his drawing with his hand, pushing the notebook out of sight. He didn't want her to see what he had been working on. Not yet. He stood up and opened the door, forcing a smile. "Yeah, Mom. Just, working on some stuff." She looked at him carefully. "Everything okay?" Elijah nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. "Yeah. Just thinking." His mom gave him a long look, her eyes full of questions that Elijah wasn't ready to answer. But then she smiled, the warmth in her face spreading to him. "Well, I'm glad to see you thinking. Just remember, sometimes, it's okay to take a break, too. Don't let everything get too heavy, okay?" Elijah smiled back, though he wasn't sure he had any answer for that. He didn't know if he could stop thinking about it. But he was beginning to realize that maybe, just maybe, there was more to life than numbers. Maybe there was a way to make the world make sense without losing the very thing that had always given him hope. The weeks that followed Elijah's discovery in the library were a whirlwind. He immersed himself deeper into the world of numbers, patterns, and the beauty of mathematics. A world that once felt like an isolated puzzle was now his refuge. It wasn't just about solving equations or memorizing formulas, it was about understanding how everything, from the spirals and shells to the galaxies overhead, was interconnected by the same invisible thread, math. But as much as Elijah found solace in these patterns, something was still gnawing at him. Despite his newfound knowledge, despite the joy he felt when his equations made sense and his drawings spiraled beautifully, there was still one thing he couldn't escape, the tension with Mr. Reynolds. Mr. Reynolds had always been his teacher, but now, Elijah saw him as something else, a symbol of everything he couldn't escape. It was the way Mr. Reynolds had laughed at him, his casual dismissal of Elijah's obsession with numbers. At first, Elijah had been able to brush it off. After all, wasn't Mr. Reynolds just doing his job? But the more Elijah thought about it, the more his doubts grew. Was Mr. Reynolds right? Was he truly just wasting his time, thinking that numbers could make sense of the chaos around him. Could he really create something more than a dream with this passion? Or was he simply lost in an illusion? One afternoon, Elijah sat at his desk, a sketchbook filled with spirals, fractals, and geometric shapes spread out in front of him. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Outside, the world seemed to move in a blur, the cars passing by, the laughter of children playing in the street, the distant hum of life going on. But inside, Elijah's thoughts were loud. He could feel the weight of it all pressing against him. He was trapped between two worlds, the world of numbers, where he felt free, and the world of his classmates and teachers, where he was constantly questioned. It wasn't just about Mr. Reynolds anymore, it was about something deeper. It was about his identity, his place in the world. Just then, the door to his room creaked open. His mother entered, her soft voice breaking through the fog of his thoughts. "Elijah? You okay?" Elijah looked up, blinking as if waking from a dream. He hadn't even heard her enter. "Yeah, Mom. I'm fine." But she didn't believe him. She walked over and sat down beside him, her gaze soft but insistent. "Elijah, I can tell when something's wrong. You've been quiet lately. Is it about school?" He sighed and leaned back in his chair, running his fingers through his hair. He wasn't sure how to explain it to her. How could he explain the turmoil inside him, the conflicting emotions, the doubt that now haunted him every time he sat in class, every time Mr. Reynolds made a joke at his expense? It's hard to explain, Mom. I don't know what I'm doing, or if I even belong. I've been working on something that makes sense to me, but it feels like no one else understands. Like they think I'm crazy." He paused, swallowing hard. "And Mr. Reynolds, he laughed at me, Mom. He doesn't see it. He doesn't see how important this is." His mother was quiet for a long moment, the weight of his words hanging in the air between them. Finally, she spoke. "Your passion isn't something to hide, Elijah. It's what makes you unique. And maybe not everyone will understand it right away, but that doesn't mean it's not important. It doesn't mean you should stop." Elijah's heart clenched at her words. But there was still a lingering doubt. A part of him still felt like he wasn't enough, that no matter how much he learned, no matter how many numbers he solved, he wouldn't be able to bridge the gap between his world and the world around him. The next day, Elijah entered Mr. Reynolds's class with a nervous knot in his stomach. He had resolved to keep his focus, to bury his doubts under the weight of his work. But as soon as he stepped into the room, he could feel the tension in the air. His classmates were talking in hushed voices, their eyes occasionally flicking toward him, and he could sense the usual judgment in the air. It was as though they could see him as the odd one out. Mr. Reynolds stood at the front of the room, flipping through papers, his back turned to the class. Elijah took his seat, staring at the desk in front of him. For a moment, he wondered if he should just stay quiet, keep his thoughts to himself, and let the world go on around him. But something stirred inside him. The memories of the library, the hours he spent studying patterns, the spirals and fractals that had begun to take shape in his mind, all came rushing back. The knowledge he had gained, the understanding that math wasn't just about solving problems but about seeing the world in a different way, filled him with an overwhelming sense of purpose. Elijah stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Every eye in the room turned to him. He took a deep breath, his palms sweating. For a moment, he felt like he was standing on the edge of something huge, something dangerous. "I want to show you something," Elijah said, his voice steadier than he expected. He walked to the front of the class, his mind racing. Mr. Reynolds raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. Elijah took out his sketchbook and opened it to the page where he had drawn the spiral. The numbers were there, but they weren't just numbers. They were a representation of something larger, something beyond mere math. He placed the sketchbook on the desk and began to explain, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "This spiral, it's more than just a drawing. It's part of a sequence, a pattern that exists everywhere in nature, in the way plants grow, in the shape of galaxies, in the way our hearts beat. This isn't just an obsession. It's a way of seeing the world. It's how I make sense of things. The room was silent. For a moment, no one moved, and Elijah thought he might have made a mistake. But then he looked up at Mr. Reynolds. The older man was staring at him, his expression unreadable. For a heartbeat, the world stood still, as though everything had stopped moving. Finally, Mr. Reynolds spoke. Elijah. I had no idea. I didn't realize. Elijah swallowed hard, unsure of what was coming next. You laughed at me before. You said this wasn't important. I was wrong, Mr. Reynolds said quietly, his tone softer than Elijah had ever heard it. I see now that I misunderstood. What you're doing, what you're showing us, is more than just numbers. It's something deeper. Elijah's heart swelled with an emotion he couldn't quite name. It was relief, but also a sense of triumph. He had done it. He had shown them. And in that moment, he realized something else. It didn't matter whether anyone else understood. What mattered was that he believed in it. And that was enough. The room was still quiet, but Elijah felt something change. The tension that had built up inside him for so long began to melt away, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. As he returned to his seat, a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. The days after that pivotal moment in Mr. Reynolds's class passed by in a blur, but they were different. Elijah could feel it. There was a weight lifted off his shoulders, a sense of freedom he hadn't known before. He had shown them who he was, and they had accepted him, not just the numbers, but the person behind them. In the days that followed, the atmosphere at school shifted. Mr. Reynolds, while still the strict teacher he had always been, had changed in a way Elijah couldn't quite explain. He didn't laugh anymore when Elijah spoke about numbers or patterns. Instead, he listened, and even on occasion, he would ask questions, as if genuinely curious about the things Elijah was learning. It wasn't the full validation Elijah had hoped for, but it was enough. He felt seen, and that was all he had needed. His classmates, too, seemed to respect him more. The whispers that had once followed him around had quieted down. Some of them even asked him about his math and the things he was working on, and Elijah, with newfound confidence, was more than willing to share his passion. There was no fear of judgment now. In fact, it felt as if they were the ones who were curious about him, about his mind, about what made him tick. The confidence that grew from that simple act of sharing, of standing up in front of the class and revealing his world, began to change Elijah. His anxiety, the nagging feeling that he was different and that his difference wasn't accepted, started to fade away. It was replaced with a sense of belonging. The world of numbers wasn't just his escape anymore, it was his bridge to the world around him. The patterns he once studied alone were now part of a larger conversation, one that had just begun. One evening, after dinner, Elijah sat in his room, scribbling in his sketchbook. The lines of numbers and spirals filled the page, but his thoughts were elsewhere. The familiar sense of calm he had once felt when immersed in his drawings was now tinged with something else, a deep, quiet realization. He had done something he never thought possible, he had allowed his passion to take root, to grow and flourish. For so long, he had been afraid that his obsession with numbers would isolate him, that it would push people away. But instead, it had brought him closer to the very people he feared would never understand him. Mr. Reynolds had been the first step, but it hadn't stopped there. Elijah now saw the world around him differently. He was no longer running from his passion, he was living it. The realization was a quiet one, but it hit him with a profound weight. Elijah had never expected to feel this way, this sense of peace, this clarity. The doubt that once clouded his thoughts had dissipated. He understood, now more than ever, that being true to himself was the key to finding his place in the world. As he continued to sketch, a knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was his mother, holding a cup of tea in her hands. "Elijah," she said softly, stepping into the room. "Can we talk?" Elijah smiled and motioned for her to sit. He had grown used to their quiet conversations over tea, their moments of connection that were always comforting, like a thread tying him back to the reality he sometimes struggled to hold on to. "You've been quiet tonight," she said, settling down beside him. "You okay?" Elijah paused, looking down at the page in front of him. He ran a finger over the spiral he had drawn, feeling the smoothness of the paper under his fingertips. It was a simple drawing, but it felt different to him now. It wasn't just lines and curves, it was his journey, his story. It was everything he had been through and everything he was still becoming. "I'm good, Mom," he said, his voice steady. "I'm really good. I think I've finally figured something out." His mother smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. "What's that?" "That I don't have to hide who I am anymore. I don't have to worry about fitting in. I'm okay with being me. And it's okay that other people don't always get it." Elijah paused, meeting his mother's gaze. "I don't need their approval. I just need to keep doing what I love." His mother's eyes softened, her expression full of pride. She reached over and squeezed his hand. "I've always known that you'd figure it out, Elijah. You've got something special. But it's not just about numbers. It's about what those numbers do for you, how they help you understand the world. You've got a gift, and I know you're going to do great things with it." Elijah nodded, feeling a wave of emotion swell inside him. His mother's words meant more than he could ever express. They weren't just a mother's encouragement, they were a reminder that he didn't have to prove anything to anyone. He didn't need to be someone he wasn't to be valued. His uniqueness was his strength, not his weakness. "Thanks, Mom," Elijah said quietly, his voice full of gratitude. "I'm starting to believe it, too." That night, as Elijah lay in bed, the weight of the past few months settled on him. He thought back to the boy who had walked into Mr. Reynolds's class, afraid to speak his truth, afraid of being misunderstood. That boy was gone now. He had been replaced by someone stronger, someone who understood the power of his own voice. Elijah had learned that true belonging didn't come from being like everyone else. It came from embracing who you were, flaws and all, and letting that truth be the foundation of everything you did. His journey wasn't over, but it had taken a turn towards something far more important than any equation or formula. It had turned towards self-acceptance. And for the first time in a long time, Elijah felt at peace with who he was and where he was going. Elijah sat in the quiet of his room one Saturday morning, a stack of papers scattered across his desk. The sun filtered through the window, casting a soft glow over the pages, illuminating the numbers and equations he had been working on all week. But today, it wasn't just about the numbers. Today, he was thinking about what came next. The world outside his window seemed to hum with possibility, and for the first time in his life, Elijah felt like he was standing on the edge of something big. He had been quiet about his dreams for so long, afraid of what people would think. But now, after everything that had happened, after sharing his obsession with numbers with the class, after the acceptance he had found, Elijah knew that he could no longer keep his dreams hidden. Mr. Reynolds had been right about one thing. There was something unique in the way Elijah saw the world. His mind didn't just see numbers, it saw patterns, connections, solutions. It was a way of thinking that others didn't understand, and maybe that was okay. But Elijah didn't want to keep that gift to himself anymore. He wanted to share it with the world. He turned his attention back to the stack of papers. A few days ago, Mr. Reynolds had handed out a flyer announcing the school's upcoming regional math competition. At first, Elijah had dismissed it, not believing that he could compete. But now, with the confidence he had gained, he was considering it. The idea of competing, of standing up and showing the world just how far he could take his love for numbers, thrilled him. Elijah had always believed that he was too different to fit in, too absorbed in his own thoughts to be part of something bigger. But now, he realized that the very thing that made him different was what would set him apart. It was the way his mind worked, the way it could find answers to problems others couldn't even understand, that would make him stand out. This competition could be his chance to prove that he was more than just the kid who got lost in his numbers. He could be the one who changed the game. His heart raced at the thought, and for the first time, he wasn't afraid. He wasn't afraid of failure. He wasn't afraid of being laughed at. He wasn't even afraid of standing in front of people and showing them what he could do. What mattered was that he was doing something for himself, something that would let him take the next step toward his future. The next step. That was what Elijah had been missing for so long. He had spent so much time hiding behind his numbers, never fully embracing them, never fully embracing who he was. Now, with his confidence building, he could see that the future was wide open. It wasn't just about being smart. It was about using his mind, his gift, to make an impact. But he knew there were obstacles. There would be people who didn't understand. There would be those who still saw him as different, as too obsessed with something that didn't make sense. Even now, Elijah could feel the weight of their expectations, their judgment. He had already faced some of it with Mr. Reynolds, but what about the other kids? What about the ones who hadn't looked at him with understanding? What about the ones who had laughed at his passion for numbers? The competition was more than just a chance to prove himself academically. It was a chance to show the world, and himself, that his passion was valid, that it mattered. That it wasn't just something he did to escape, but something he did to live. This was his next step, the one he had to take to fully embrace the person he was becoming. But there was still one question that gnawed at him. Could he really do it? Was he ready to take the plunge, to step into a world that was unfamiliar and full of uncertainty? Before he could answer himself, there was a knock on his door. His mother poked her head in, holding a tray with a warm cup of tea. "Mind if I come in?" she asked, her voice gentle but filled with that quiet authority Elijah had come to trust over the years. Elijah smiled and nodded. Of course. She walked in and set the tray down on his desk, then sat down beside him, picking up one of the papers from the stack. "I see you've been busy," she said, studying his work. "What's all this?" "It's for the math competition," Elijah replied, not taking his eyes off the page. "I'm thinking of entering." His mother's expression softened, a quiet smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I think that's a wonderful idea," she said after a beat. "But you've got a lot on your plate, Elijah. Are you sure you're ready for something like this?" Elijah leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping the side of the desk. He hadn't thought much about how his mom might feel about it. She had always supported him, but this was different. This wasn't just a school project. This was something bigger. This was his chance to really test himself, to see how far his mind could take him. "I don't know if I'm ready," Elijah admitted quietly. "But I want to try. I don't want to keep hiding behind my numbers. I want to show people that what I'm doing matters." His mother's smile deepened, and she reached over, resting her hand on his. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone, Elijah. But if this is something you want to do, something that makes you feel alive, then I'm here for you. Always." Her words settled deep within him, grounding him in a way he hadn't expected. She wasn't just giving him permission to pursue his passion, she was giving him the freedom to fail. She was reminding him that it wasn't about being perfect. It was about trying, about pushing himself to see what he could really do. "I'll do it," Elijah said, his voice firm now, filled with conviction. "I'm going to enter the competition. And no matter what happens, I'm going to give it my all." His mother nodded, standing up to leave the room. "That's my boy," she said softly, her voice filled with pride. "You've got this." As the door closed behind her, Elijah looked back at the papers on his desk. The challenge was now real. It wasn't just about solving equations in the comfort of his room anymore. It was about stepping into the unknown, about embracing the next step. And this time, he wasn't afraid. The competition was only a few weeks away, but for Elijah, it felt like a lifetime. Every day, after school, he would retreat into his room, surrounded by equations, theories, and numbers. His desk, once a simple space for homework, had transformed into a mini-war room, filled with notepads, textbooks, and sticky notes covered in scribbles and formulas. Elijah had always been a quick learner, but the depth of the material for the competition was daunting. It wasn't like the regular math lessons he was used to. The problems he faced now weren't just about solving for x or finding the area of a circle. They were complex, intricate puzzles that stretched his mind in ways he hadn't imagined. Each time he cracked a problem, it felt like a small victory, but there were always more problems waiting to be solved. His mother had been right to encourage him, but there were days when Elijah couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he was in over his head. Was he really cut out for this? He had been the kid who spent more time lost in numbers than in socializing with others. Now, he was stepping into a world where the best of the best would compete. Was his obsession with numbers enough to get him through? But it was more than that. Elijah knew that this competition was about more than just proving his math skills. It was about showing himself, and the world, that his passion for numbers wasn't something to be laughed at or dismissed. It was something worth celebrating. Despite the doubts, there was a fire inside him now, a determination he hadn't felt before. And every time he doubted himself, he thought back to that moment in Mr. Reynolds' classroom, when he had drawn the sequence on the board, when the world had stopped to watch. That was the moment he realized that his gift for numbers wasn't a curse or a weakness, it was his strength. It was the key to unlocking his future. The first few days of preparation were rough. He struggled to balance his schoolwork with his practice for the competition. His friends started to notice that he was distant, lost in his own world, too consumed with solving problems to hang out with them. And it wasn't just them. Elijah's teachers seemed to notice, too. Mrs. Morgan, the history teacher, asked him one afternoon if everything was okay. "You've been awfully quiet lately, Elijah," she said, handing him an assignment. "Everything all right at home?" Elijah looked up, startled by the concern in her voice. He hadn't realized how much his obsession with the competition was affecting his other classes. "Yeah, everything's fine," he muttered, glancing at the math problems on his desk. "Just, a lot going on." Mrs. Morgan studied him for a moment, then smiled. "If you ever need to talk, you know where to find me. Just don't forget to take care of yourself, okay?" It wasn't the first time a teacher had checked on him, but it hit differently this time. The idea that people cared about him beyond his math abilities gave him a new perspective. Elijah wasn't alone in this. People were noticing, supporting him in ways he hadn't expected. His friends, though, seemed to drift further away. Whenever they invited him to hang out, he would make excuses about needing to study, needing to prepare. He was losing touch with the one thing that had always kept him grounded, his friendships. One afternoon, after school, Elijah was sitting in his room, working through a particularly tough problem, when his phone buzzed. It was a message from Marcus, one of his best friends. "Hey, you coming to the game tonight? You've been kinda distant lately. We miss you, man." Elijah stared at the message, his mind spinning. The game. It was always the biggest event of the week. He used to love going, sitting in the bleachers, and shouting with his friends. It had been a long time since he had felt that sense of camaraderie. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was in the middle of something bigger now. Something that could change everything. Elijah hesitated, then typed a response. "I can't tonight. I've got to focus on the competition. But I'll catch up with you guys soon. Promise." He put the phone down and went back to his equations, but something didn't sit right. He wanted to be there for his friends. They had always been there for him. But he had to stay focused. This competition was important, not just for his future, but for his growth. Later that evening, as Elijah prepared a quick dinner in the kitchen, his mother entered the room, her face filled with a quiet concern. "How's the studying going?" she asked. "Fine," Elijah said quickly, not looking up. He didn't want to worry her. She had enough on her plate already. "You sure?" She didn't buy it. "You've been spending a lot of time in your room. I know this competition is important, but don't forget that there's more to life than numbers." Elijah set the spatula down, suddenly feeling the weight of her words. He had been so absorbed in his work that he hadn't stopped to take a breath. He had isolated himself, focused so intently on proving himself that he had forgotten to live in the moment. "I know, Mom," he said softly. "It's just. I want to do well. I want to show everyone that I'm more than just the kid who likes numbers." She smiled, that familiar warmth spreading across her face. "Elijah, you don't have to prove anything to anyone. You're already more than enough just the way you are." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He had spent so much time trying to earn the approval of others, trying to prove his worth, that he had forgotten the most important lesson his mother had taught him, that his worth wasn't tied to anyone's opinion. The competition wasn't just about winning. It was about believing in himself, trusting that he had something valuable to offer the world. Whether or not he won didn't matter. What mattered was that he was willing to take the risk, to step outside of his comfort zone. "I guess I've been a little too focused," Elijah admitted, his voice a bit more vulnerable than he intended. "Thanks, Mom." She gave him a hug, squeezing him tight. "You're going to do great, Elijah. Just remember to breathe and take it one step at a time." Elijah nodded, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about doing his best and staying true to himself. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was a road he was ready to walk. That night, he sent a message to Marcus, apologizing for missing the game. "I've got a lot to focus on," he wrote. "But I'll be there next time. Promise." The next step was clear. Elijah didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He just needed to prove to himself that he could follow through. And that was enough. The days seemed to stretch on forever, each one heavier than the last. The math competition was only a week away, and Elijah could feel the pressure building in his chest. He had prepared endlessly, running through problems, revising equations, and memorizing formulas until his mind felt like it might burst. But no amount of studying seemed to erase the gnawing feeling that he wasn't ready, that somehow, he would fall short. Every morning, as he walked to school, his thoughts were consumed by the looming challenge. His steps were slow, like the weight of the competition was dragging him down. He had always been good at math, sure, but this was different. This was the opportunity to prove something, not just to his classmates and teachers, but to himself. Could he really do it? Was he prepared enough? And what if he failed? It wasn't the first time Elijah had doubted himself. His whole life, he had been the quiet kid who kept his head down and worked in the background, never drawing too much attention. Even after he made his bold move on the chalkboard that day, the feeling of being judged, of having people laugh at him, still lingered. He wondered if all of this was just a way for him to prove something that didn't need to be proven. The night before the competition, Elijah sat at his desk, surrounded by a mountain of notes, textbooks, and the scraps of paper that held his thoughts and equations. He had stayed up late, hoping for some divine insight, some flash of brilliance that would make everything click. But as the clock ticked past midnight, the only thing he could hear was the beating of his own heart, louder than the quiet hum of his computer. "Why am I doing this?" he whispered to himself, staring at the endless scribbles in front of him. The numbers and symbols danced in his eyes, shifting and swirling until they no longer made sense. He was so close to the edge of exhaustion, yet the weight of the competition felt heavier than ever. But just as Elijah was about to give in to his exhaustion, there was a knock at his door. "Everything okay, Elijah?" His mom's voice was soft and full of concern. Elijah stood up, walking over to open the door. His mother stood there, looking at him with warm, understanding eyes. She knew the pressure he was under, but she also knew when he needed space and when he needed a reminder of what really mattered. "I'm fine," Elijah said, his voice strained. "Just, trying to make sense of everything." She stepped into the room and looked at the piles of paper scattered across his desk. "You've been working hard," she said gently. "But don't forget to take a breath. You've already done more than enough. You don't have to be perfect, Elijah. Just be yourself." He sighed deeply, feeling the weight of his mother's words sink in. Her calm presence reminded him of the things he'd been forgetting in the chaos of preparation, that it wasn't about being the best, or proving anything to anyone. It was about doing his best and trusting that it would be enough. "I just want to do well," Elijah admitted, his voice softening. "I don't want to let anyone down. I don't want to disappoint myself." "You're not going to disappoint anyone," she said, her voice firm yet loving. "You've already shown everyone what you're capable of. The fact that you're even doing this competition is proof enough that you're strong, brave, and talented. You've already won in my eyes." Elijah smiled faintly, feeling the knot in his chest loosen just a little. His mother had always been his biggest supporter, but it wasn't just her words that calmed him. It was the reminder that he didn't have to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders alone. After a moment, she pulled him into a hug. "Get some rest, Elijah. You've got this." He nodded, returning the embrace. "Thanks, Mom." As his mother left the room, Elijah stood there for a moment, taking in her words. They echoed in his mind as he looked back at his desk, at the sea of numbers and formulas that had consumed him for the past few weeks. He had worked so hard to prepare, but now it was time to step back and trust in the process. He had already done everything he could. Tomorrow, he would give it his all, and that would be enough. Elijah turned off his computer, cleared the papers from his desk, and finally climbed into bed. But sleep didn't come easily. His mind raced with thoughts of the competition. What if he wasn't fast enough? What if the other competitors were better prepared? What if he made a mistake and it cost him everything? But somewhere, deep down, Elijah knew that these fears were just distractions from the truth he had known all along. He had the power to succeed, not because he was perfect, but because he had the passion, the dedication, and the heart to give it everything he had. The next morning, Elijah woke up to a clear, crisp day. The sun streamed through his window, casting a warm glow across the room. It was the kind of morning that made him feel like anything was possible. He took a deep breath and got dressed, putting on the same clothes he always wore on important days, his favorite hoodie, jeans, and sneakers. He didn't need anything fancy. This was his day to show the world who he really was. At breakfast, his mom smiled at him, setting a plate of pancakes in front of him. "You're going to do great today," she said, as if reading his thoughts. Elijah smiled back, his nerves easing slightly. "Thanks, Mom." After breakfast, he gathered his things and headed to school. The air felt different today, charged, like the start of something big. As he walked into the school building, he could feel the eyes of his classmates on him. There were whispers, excited murmurs about the competition. Everyone knew that Elijah was a contender, but no one really knew what he was made of. As he walked through the hallways, he passed Mr. Reynolds' classroom. For a moment, he hesitated, but then he pushed the door open and stepped inside. Mr. Reynolds was at his desk, flipping through a stack of papers. "Hey, Mr. Reynolds," Elijah said, his voice more confident than he felt. Mr. Reynolds looked up and smiled. "Ah, Elijah. The big day is here, huh?" "Yeah," Elijah said, standing a little taller. "I'm ready." Mr. Reynolds raised an eyebrow, his expression shifting to one of genuine respect. "Good luck, Elijah. You've got this." For the first time in weeks, Elijah felt a spark of confidence. Maybe he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Maybe all he needed to do was trust in himself. The bell rang, signaling the start of the school day. As Elijah walked toward the auditorium for the competition, he knew the real challenge wasn't just about the problems on the paper, it was about proving to himself that he was more than just a kid who loved numbers. Today, Elijah was going to show everyone who he really was. The day had finally arrived. The morning sun seemed to shine brighter than it ever had before, casting long shadows across the hallway as Elijah walked into the school building. It was the first Monday of the competition week, and the air felt thick with anticipation, almost electric. He could feel the weight of the event pressing down on him with every step, but he pushed it aside, reminding himself of everything he had worked for. His hands were clammy, his heart raced in his chest, but Elijah knew that he had no choice now but to face it head-on. The math competition was more than just a test of numbers and equations, it was a test of everything he had fought for, his self-belief, his dedication, and his courage. He wasn't just competing for the trophy, or even for the praise. He was competing for his own sense of purpose. Walking through the front doors of the school, Elijah spotted his friends in the hallway. They were already buzzing with excitement, a mixture of nerves and enthusiasm in their voices. He nodded at them, offering a quick smile, but his mind was elsewhere. Everyone had high expectations for him. They all believed in him, some even saw him as the favorite to win. But the truth was, Elijah wasn't sure if he could live up to those expectations. The weight of it all was starting to feel unbearable. His mind wandered back to the days of preparation. He had practiced countless hours, solving equations late into the night, revising each step, but the nagging thought that he might not be good enough still lingered. He tried to push it away, focusing on the tasks ahead. Today was the day to prove that he was ready. As Elijah entered the classroom, he noticed the nervous energy in the air. The other students were sitting at their desks, checking and rechecking their notes, fidgeting with their pencils, and whispering quietly among themselves. Everyone was on edge, but no one more so than Elijah. He walked over to his desk, setting down his backpack, and took a deep breath. "You've got this," he whispered to himself, his fingers tightening around the straps of his bag. Mr. Reynolds, who had become a steady presence in Elijah's life over the past few weeks, stood at the front of the classroom, preparing the materials for the competition. He looked up and gave Elijah a reassuring smile, one that made the weight on Elijah's shoulders feel just a little lighter. "Feeling ready, Elijah?" Mr. Reynolds asked, his tone calm but supportive. Elijah nodded, though the uncertainty in his chest hadn't quite faded. "I think so. I've worked as hard as I can. That's all anyone can ask for, Mr. Reynolds said, his eyes meeting Elijah's with a sincerity that made him feel a little less alone. The bell rang, signaling the start of the competition, and the students took their seats. Elijah could feel his pulse quicken, his stomach doing flips as the room filled with the sound of rustling papers and the scribble of pencils against paper. This was it. The moment of truth. "Good luck, everyone," Mr. Reynolds said, giving one last encouraging glance to his students before beginning the competition. He handed out the test packets, and Elijah's heart skipped a beat as he took his. He glanced down at the first problem. Simple enough. He was familiar with this type of equation, something involving algebraic manipulation and factoring. Elijah felt a small sigh of relief. He worked through it methodically, keeping his breathing steady. The solution seemed to come naturally, and soon, he was on to the next question. Another algebraic problem, this time involving a complex fraction. As Elijah worked through the problems, he began to relax. His mind cleared, and the rhythm of solving equations became like second nature. It was as if he had entered a flow state, a place where everything he had practiced came together. His pen moved quickly across the paper, and the doubts that had plagued him just hours before began to recede into the background. The problems weren't easy, but they weren't impossible either. Elijah could feel his confidence building with every question he answered. As the clock ticked down, he worked through the problems with precision, checking each solution carefully before moving on. The pressure hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had transformed from something paralyzing into something manageable. Halfway through the exam, Elijah glanced around the room. His classmates were all focused on their papers, their faces a mix of concentration and determination. Some were scribbling furiously, others pausing to think. But Elijah was calm now. He felt like he had found his rhythm. For the first time since the competition had been announced, he felt like he was truly in control. As he reached the final section of the test, Elijah encountered a problem he hadn't expected. It was a challenge, a real brain teaser that required more than just memorization and practice. The problem seemed to stretch on forever, each part more complex than the last. Elijah paused, his mind racing to piece together the steps. He stared at the numbers, trying to make sense of them. The clock was ticking down, and the weight of the competition pressed down harder than before. He had solved most of the test, but this one problem could ruin everything. For a moment, Elijah panicked. His thoughts raced, his hands shaking as he gripped his pencil tighter. What if he couldn't solve it? What if this was the question that would cost him everything? He glanced around the room again, but no one seemed to be struggling the way he was. Everyone else was either scribbling away or already moving on to the final questions. Then, like a light bulb flicking on, Elijah remembered something his mother had told him the night before: "You've already done more than enough. Just be yourself." Elijah took a deep breath and began to break down the problem, one step at a time. He didn't rush, didn't panic. With each move, the equation began to unravel, the pieces falling into place. His heart slowed as he worked through the final steps, solving the equation just before the timer went off. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling a long breath. He had done it. The bell rang, signaling the end of the competition, and Elijah looked down at his paper, his heart racing with both relief and a hint of excitement. It wasn't perfect, but it was his best. And for the first time in weeks, he felt at peace with that. As the students handed in their papers and left the room, Elijah felt a quiet sense of pride wash over him. No matter the outcome, he knew he had faced his fears, pushed through the doubt, and given it everything he had. He had proven to himself that he was capable of more than just numbers. He was capable of overcoming his own obstacles. The days between the competition and the announcement of the results felt like they dragged on endlessly. Elijah tried to keep his mind occupied with other things: homework, helping his mom with household chores, spending time with his friends, but the nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach never fully went away. Every time he passed by Mr. Reynolds' classroom, he could hear the quiet murmur of the other students talking about the competition. Some were already talking about their chances, wondering if they'd made the cut for the finals, while others were nervously speculating about how hard the questions had been. Elijah didn't join in the chatter. He stayed quiet, focused on his own thoughts. It wasn't that he didn't want to know the outcome, he did, of course. But he was afraid. Afraid that despite everything he had done, all the hours spent practicing and revising, it might not be enough. Afraid that the weight of his own expectations would come crashing down on him, shattering the fragile sense of hope he had built for himself. One afternoon, after the final bell rang, Elijah found himself standing outside Mr. Reynolds' classroom. He hesitated for a moment, watching as other students filed out, laughing and chatting, oblivious to the tension hanging in the air. He stepped inside. Mr. Reynolds was sitting at his desk, shuffling papers. When he looked up and saw Elijah standing there, he gave him a warm, encouraging smile. "You've been waiting for the results, huh?" Mr. Reynolds asked, his voice calm but knowing. Elijah nodded, his stomach knotting at the thought of hearing his fate. "I know this is tough, Mr. Reynolds continued, but remember, this isn't the end of the road. It's just a step." Elijah nodded again, swallowing hard. He had heard those words before, but hearing them now, they felt different. It was as if Mr. Reynolds was giving him permission to feel however he felt, without the weight of judgment. Elijah appreciated that. It made him feel seen, as a person, not just as a student. Don't worry, Elijah, Mr. Reynolds said, standing up from his desk. You've already shown me what you're capable of. No matter what the results are, you've proven something to yourself. Elijah looked down at the floor, his heart racing. Then, the door to the classroom opened, and in walked Ms. Carter, the school's principal. She smiled at Elijah and Mr. Reynolds as she approached. She was holding a stack of papers in her hands. Well, it's time to find out, she said, her voice filled with excitement. Let's get this over with. Elijah felt his breath catch in his throat. This was it. The moment that would determine whether all of his hard work had been enough. He didn't know what he was expecting, but the silence in the room made everything feel amplified. The world outside seemed to disappear, leaving only the sound of his pounding heartbeat. Ms. Carter handed Mr. Reynolds the stack of papers, and Elijah's stomach twisted even tighter. She gestured for Elijah to take a seat, which he did reluctantly, his mind spinning. Mr. Reynolds opened the top sheet, scanned it quickly, and then set it down on the desk. He looked at Elijah, his face unreadable. Elijah, he said slowly, you did it. Elijah's heart skipped a beat, unsure if he had heard correctly. What do you mean? You got first place in the competition. You're the top scorer, Mr. Reynolds continued, his voice steady but filled with pride. Not only did you answer every question correctly, but you also finished with time to spare. That's incredible, Elijah. The words hung in the air, suspended between disbelief and joy. Elijah's mouth went dry, and for a moment, he couldn't find the words. All he could do was stare at Mr. Reynolds, his mind struggling to process what he was hearing. He had done it. Against all the odds, he had won. A flood of emotions overwhelmed him, relief, pride, disbelief. His eyes stung, and he blinked hard, trying to fight back the tears that threatened to spill. After everything, all the doubts, all the fears, all the pressure, he had done it. Mr. Reynolds smiled warmly at him, his eyes twinkling with approval. You earned this, Elijah. It wasn't just your ability with numbers, it was your determination and your willingness to push through even when it seemed impossible. For a moment, Elijah felt as if he were floating, suspended in time. It was as though the weight of the past few months had been lifted in an instant. The long hours of studying, the sleepless nights, the self-doubt, it had all been worth it. And more than anything, Elijah realized that this victory wasn't just about the trophy. It was about the person he had become in the process. Ms. Carter stepped forward and handed him a small trophy, a shiny symbol of his achievement. It glinted in the light, and for the first time in a long while, Elijah felt a sense of pride that went beyond the surface. Congratulations, Elijah, she said warmly. You've proven that hard work really does pay off. Elijah took the trophy with shaking hands, his heart still pounding in his chest. Thank you, he managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. As he turned to leave the classroom, he felt a sudden surge of gratitude for the people who had helped him along the way, his mother, Mr. Reynolds, his friends. It wasn't just about the numbers. It was about the people who had believed in him when he hadn't even believed in himself. Walking out of the classroom, Elijah couldn't stop smiling. The day that had started with so much uncertainty had turned into the day of his triumph. And in that moment, he realized that the journey wasn't over, it had only just begun. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The feeling of triumph that Elijah had felt when he won the math competition didn't last as long as he hoped. In the days following his victory, the buzz around school was palpable. Everyone was congratulating him, offering high fives, and teachers were offering words of praise. But as the excitement died down, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. It wasn't that he wasn't grateful for his success, far from it. Winning first place was a huge accomplishment, and it had filled him with a sense of pride he hadn't felt in a long time. But deep down, Elijah knew that the satisfaction of winning wouldn't be enough to keep him satisfied for long. The truth was, he needed something more. He had achieved his goal, but he was starting to realize that achieving one goal didn't necessarily mean the journey was over. He had spent so much time focused on the competition, on the numbers, and on the goal of winning. Now that it was behind him, Elijah felt empty. A strange sense of quiet had settled over him, as though the road ahead was still unclear. He had proven to everyone, but mostly to himself, that he had what it took to succeed. But success in one area of life didn't automatically mean everything would fall into place. Elijah knew he had to keep pushing forward. The realization hit him during one of his quiet moments at home. His mother, as usual, was busy in the kitchen, and Elijah sat at the small dining table, his eyes focused on the open math book in front of him. For the first time in days, he wasn't focusing on solving problems. Instead, he was thinking about the future. About what came next. Elijah's gaze wandered to the wall, where a small plaque from his recent win hung proudly. For a moment, he almost felt embarrassed by it, as if the shiny trophy was just a symbol of what he had already outgrown. But it was also a reminder of what he could achieve when he put his mind to it. It was an achievement, but it was also a stepping stone. "Mom," Elijah called, his voice uncertain. She poked her head out from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. "Can I talk to you about something?" His mother raised an eyebrow, a slight smile on her face. "Of course, Elijah. What's on your mind?" "I'm thinking, maybe there's something else I should be doing. Something bigger. I don't want to stop here. I want to do more. Something that really challenges me." She tilted her head, considering her son's words. "You've done a lot already. You won that competition, and I can see how proud you are of that." Elijah nodded, but there was a restlessness in his expression. "I know, but it feels like, it's not enough anymore. I want to push myself further. What if there's another challenge out there, something that will take me beyond just math problems?" His mother put down the towel and walked over to sit beside him. "I see. You've got that fire in you, don't you?" She smiled softly, her eyes filled with pride. "That's a good thing, Elijah. I've always known you were destined for great things." "I don't know what's next," Elijah confessed, "but I feel like I need to do something bigger. Something that will push me to be even better than I am right now." His mother nodded, understanding. She didn't say anything at first, but Elijah could see the wheels turning in her mind. Finally, she spoke. "Sometimes the next step in life isn't always clear right away. But the fact that you're asking yourself this means you're on the right path. Maybe it's time to find your next challenge. The world is full of opportunities, Elijah." Elijah sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his mother's words sinking in. He had thought that winning the competition would be the culmination of everything he had been working toward, but now he understood that it was just the beginning. A small victory in the grand scheme of his life. "Do you have any ideas?" his mother asked gently. "I'm not sure yet," Elijah replied. "But I think I should look into other competitions, other ways to challenge myself. Maybe there's something bigger out there, a national competition or an advanced program." His mother smiled at him, clearly proud of his determination. "Whatever you decide, Elijah, I know you'll find it. Just remember to take your time and follow your passion. You don't have to have all the answers right now." Later that evening, as Elijah lay in bed, his mind raced with possibilities. What if he could compete in national math tournaments? What if there were opportunities for him to test his skills in new ways, beyond the boundaries of his small town? He had always dreamed of making a name for himself, of showing the world that a kid like him could go far. But that night, Elijah's thoughts weren't just about the next competition. They were about the deeper journey ahead. How could he push himself beyond what he thought were his limits? What could he learn from this moment, from the victory that he now realized was just the first chapter of his story? The next day, Elijah took action. The first step was to talk to Mr. Reynolds. Elijah walked into his teacher's classroom before the bell rang, determination in his stride. Mr. Reynolds looked up from his desk, where he was grading papers, and smiled warmly as Elijah approached. "Got something on your mind, Elijah?" Mr. Reynolds asked, his tone inviting. "I've been thinking a lot about what's next," Elijah began, his voice steady. "I want to take my skills further. I want to challenge myself in a bigger way. I'm thinking about looking into national competitions. Do you think I'm ready for something like that?" Mr. Reynolds raised an eyebrow, intrigued by Elijah's sudden drive. "National competitions, huh? You're serious about this?" "I am," Elijah said with conviction. "I want to see just how far I can go. I know I've got potential, but I need to know if I'm truly ready for the next step. Do you think it's possible?" Mr. Reynolds stood up and walked over to his whiteboard, grabbing a marker. "It's more than possible, Elijah. It's all about preparation and belief in yourself. If you're willing to put in the work, I think you can go as far as you want." Elijah's decision to pursue bigger challenges felt like a weight lifted from his shoulders. The realization that he wasn't just a winner of a local competition, but a young person capable of far greater things, gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt before. The future was no longer this vague concept, it was a concrete path leading to something unknown, and that was both terrifying and exciting. As soon as he returned home from his conversation with Mr. Reynolds, Elijah dove into research. He spent hours online, researching national math competitions, advanced programs, and even summer math camps that could push him beyond what he had already accomplished. It was overwhelming at first. So many options. So many unknowns. But the more he read, the more he became certain that this was the next step in his journey. His mind raced with questions. Which one of these programs would be the best fit for him? How could he possibly prepare for a competition on a national scale? He had so many questions, but one thing was clear, he was going to push himself, no matter the obstacles. The next morning, after breakfast, Elijah sat down with his mother, who had her usual cup of coffee in hand, a concerned look in her eyes as she noticed the intensity with which Elijah was tackling his research. "You're working hard, aren't you?" she asked, her voice gentle but curious. "What have you found?" Elijah paused, running his fingers through his hair. "A lot," he said. "There are so many competitions and programs out there. I'm just trying to figure out which one would be the right fit for me. I've been looking into this math camp in Boston. They say it helps kids like me prepare for the big leagues." His mother leaned in, scanning the screen over his shoulder. "Boston, huh? That's pretty far from here." "I know," Elijah said, his voice tinged with excitement. "But it's one of the best. It could give me the edge I need. Plus, there's a national competition that could lead to even bigger opportunities after that." His mother took a deep breath. "It's a big commitment, Elijah. You're only a sophomore. That's a lot to take on." Elijah's heart raced. He understood the weight of her words. Moving so far away from home, dedicating himself to something as intense as a national competition, it wasn't just about math. It was about the direction his life could take. His mother was right. This wasn't a decision to be made lightly. "I know, Mom," he said quietly, turning to face her. "But this could be my chance. My chance to prove I can do more, to prove that I'm more than just a kid who's good with numbers. I want to push myself, and I know this is what I need to do to take that next step." His mother took a long look at him, her eyes soft but thoughtful. She had always known Elijah had big dreams, and though she worried about the challenges he would face, she also knew that he had something inside of him that was undeniable. "Okay," she said, her voice steady. "If this is what you really want, I'll support you. We'll figure out how to make it work. But we need to talk to your father about it. It's a big decision." Elijah felt a surge of gratitude for his mother's support, but he also knew the real challenge lay ahead. His father, who had always been the more pragmatic one, might not see things the same way. Elijah's dad was the kind of man who believed in hard work and stability. He had always encouraged Elijah to focus on practical, achievable goals. A national competition and summer camp in Boston seemed like something far beyond what his father would consider reasonable. That evening, the family sat down for dinner. Elijah knew this conversation was coming, and the nerves he had felt earlier in the day returned, creeping up in his stomach. His father, after all, was the kind of man who valued tradition and practicality. "So, what's on your mind, Elijah?" his father asked, cutting into his steak. "I've been hearing a lot of talk about math competitions lately." Elijah hesitated for a moment before speaking, trying to find the right words. "Dad, I've been doing some research. There's a summer program in Boston. It's for advanced math students. They prepare for national competitions, and it's something I think could really help me grow." His father raised an eyebrow. "Boston, huh? That's pretty far from home. How long would you be gone?" Elijah swallowed. "It's a 6-week program, and it's a big commitment. But I really think it could help me take my skills to the next level. The competition after that could open doors to even more opportunities." There was a long silence as his father processed the information. Elijah could almost see the gears turning in his dad's mind. He knew his father's tendency to play devil's advocate, to ask questions that made sure every decision was well thought out. "And what happens if you go to this program and it doesn't work out?" his father asked, his voice neutral. Elijah's heart sank. He had been preparing for this question, but that didn't make it any easier to answer. "I guess I learn from it. Even if it doesn't work out the way I hope, it'll be a chance to grow and figure out what's next. But I'm willing to take that risk." His father took a long sip of his drink, then set the glass down with a quiet sigh. "You know I don't make decisions like this lightly. But I've always believed in you, Elijah. You've proven you're capable of more than what people expect of you." Elijah felt a rush of relief. His father's approval, though cautious, was a step in the right direction. "So, you're saying you're okay with it?" His father nodded. "I think you've earned it. But you better make sure you stay focused and don't forget what got you here in the first place." "I won't forget, Dad," Elijah replied, his voice firm. "This is just the beginning." The next morning, Elijah felt the weight of his decision settle into his chest. It wasn't just the excitement of going to Boston that filled him with anticipation, it was the realization that he was about to take the next step in his journey. There was no going back now. As he sat at the table, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the surface, Elijah thought about what his parents had said. They had supported him, even if they were hesitant. They had given him the green light to move forward, but only if he remained focused on the bigger picture. Elijah smiled to himself, the tension in his body easing. He was ready for the challenge. The day Elijah received the letter of acceptance to the summer math camp in Boston felt surreal. He had opened the envelope with shaking hands, not fully believing that this moment would actually come. But there it was, a crisp, official letter offering him a spot in one of the most prestigious math programs in the country. At first, Elijah stared at the words on the page, as if they might disappear if he looked away. The letter was a clear invitation to something bigger than anything he had ever imagined. This was the opportunity he had worked so hard for. This was his chance to prove that he wasn't just a small-town kid with big dreams, he was someone with the potential to change the game. His heart raced, and the realization of how much this could mean for his future hit him like a wave. The doubts he'd carried with him for so long about his worth, his place in the world, began to fade. This was his moment. No more wondering if he was good enough. He was going to show the world what he could do. That evening, Elijah sat in the quiet of his room, staring at the letter in his hands. He had never felt so conflicted in his life. Excitement bubbled up in him, but so did fear. This program in Boston meant more than just math. It was a step into a world that was unfamiliar, full of brilliant students, intense challenges, and competition unlike anything he had faced before. His mother had been thrilled when he told her the news, her face lighting up with pride. "I knew you could do it," she had said, her voice filled with emotion. "This is your future, Elijah. You've earned it." But his father had been quieter. While he had expressed his support, there had been something cautious in his tone, as if he were unsure about letting go of his son, even though he knew it was the right thing to do. Elijah understood his father's hesitation. This was more than just a summer camp, this was the beginning of Elijah's journey into something much bigger than either of them could have anticipated. Now, sitting alone in his room, Elijah thought about what lay ahead. He would be leaving his hometown, his family, and everything he had known for 6 weeks. It wasn't just about the math. It was about growing up, about facing the unknown and stepping out into a world that might not be as kind as the one he was leaving behind. As he thought about the camp, he couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and fear. Was he truly ready for the intensity of this program? Would he be able to keep up with the other students, many of whom had probably been groomed for this kind of thing their whole lives? Elijah had always been the math kid in his school, but here, in Boston, he would be just another face in a crowd of equally talented and driven students. The next morning, as the sun streamed through his bedroom window, Elijah made a decision. He wasn't going to let fear hold him back. He had worked too hard, come too far, to let the uncertainty stop him now. He was going to Boston. He was going to challenge himself in ways he had never imagined. And he was going to prove to himself that he could succeed, no matter what. The days leading up to his departure were a whirlwind of emotions. Elijah had said his goodbyes to his friends, who had all been supportive, though some of them were surprised. They had always known him as the quiet, studious one, but even they could see the fire that had been ignited in him. "You're going to crush it," Elijah, his best friend, Marcus, had told him when they sat together one last time at their favorite diner. "Just remember us little guys when you're famous." Elijah chuckled, but he appreciated the sentiment. Marcus was always good at putting things in perspective. "Thanks, man. I'll make sure to send postcards," he said, and they both laughed. His parents helped him pack, though there was a heaviness in the air. His mother, ever the nurturing presence, kept reminding him to take care of himself. "Call me when you get there, okay?" she had said, giving him a long hug before he left. His father, as practical as always, gave him a firm handshake. "Stay focused, Elijah. Keep your head in the game." "I will, Dad," Elijah promised. He could see the pride in his father's eyes, but there was something else there too, a reluctance to let him go. Elijah's flight to Boston was long, but it gave him plenty of time to think. As the plane soared above the clouds, his mind wandered to all the unknowns ahead. He imagined walking into the math camp for the first time, surrounded by dozens of students who were just as passionate and driven as he was. It could be intimidating, but it could also be the best thing that ever happened to him. As the plane touched down in Boston, the excitement began to bubble up again. This was real. He was really here. He was about to embark on something that would shape his future in ways he couldn't even begin to comprehend. When he arrived at the camp, the first thing he noticed was how different everything felt. The campus was large, with buildings that seemed to stretch on forever. It was a far cry from his quiet, small town. The students around him, some older, some younger, were all buzzing with energy, chatting excitedly about the upcoming challenges. Elijah felt a bit out of place at first. He wasn't used to being surrounded by so many people who shared his love for math. Back home, he had always been the one to stand out. Here, he was just another face in the crowd. But that wasn't a bad thing. It meant he wasn't alone in his passion. It meant he was among others who understood the pull of numbers, the thrill of solving complex problems, the excitement of diving into abstract theories. He was where he belonged. As Elijah unpacked his things in the small dorm room that would be his home for the next 6 weeks, he thought about all that had led him here. The journey hadn't been easy, but nothing worth achieving ever was. He had come a long way from the shy boy who had once been laughed at for his obsession with numbers. This was just the beginning. He stood by the window of his dorm room, looking out over the unfamiliar city, and a sense of calm washed over him. This was his new reality, and he was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The first few days at the math camp were an overwhelming blur of introductions, schedules, and new faces. Elijah wasn't sure what he had expected, but this was nothing like he had imagined. Every time he walked into a room, the air seemed to hum with the sound of students discussing complex equations and theories, a language he knew but had never heard spoken with such confidence. Each student had a story, a background, a reason for being here. And yet, Elijah couldn't help but feel like an outsider, like the odd one out. In his small town, he had always been the one who stood apart, the one who found comfort in numbers. But here, surrounded by others with the same level of passion and drive, Elijah realized how small his world had been up until now. The math problems were complex, the lectures fast-paced, and the competition fierce. At first, Elijah felt as though he was drowning in a sea of equations, his mind struggling to keep up. He had always been a quick learner, but these students were brilliant. They were used to this environment, accustomed to the pressure, to the intensity. Elijah was the newcomer, trying to find his footing. It wasn't just the math that was challenging. It was the environment, too. The other students didn't seem to be struggling the way he was. They spoke in confident tones, their discussions full of terms and theories he only half understood. His classmates came from prestigious schools, had attended specialized programs, and carried with them the weight of years of preparation. Elijah couldn't help but feel out of place. One of his first conversations with a fellow student, a girl named Emily, summed up everything he felt. She was sitting alone at lunch, a notebook filled with scribbled equations in front of her. Elijah hesitated for a moment before approaching her. "You're Elijah, right?" she asked, glancing up at him with a warm smile. "Yeah, I'm Elijah," he said, feeling a bit unsure of himself. "I'm from a small town in Georgia." "You?" "California," Emily replied, taking a bite of her sandwich. "I've been doing math programs like this for years." Elijah nodded, trying to keep the conversation going. "Yeah, this is my first time." "I figured," Emily said, her smile never wavering. "Don't worry, you'll catch up. It's a lot at once, but you'll get there. Just keep pushing yourself." Her words were kind, but they didn't do much to ease the weight in Elijah's chest. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that he could catch up, that he wasn't too far behind. But the doubt lingered, eating at him like a slow burn. As the days wore on, the pressure continued to mount. The camp schedule was grueling. Mornings were filled with lectures on advanced calculus, abstract algebra, and number theory. Afternoons were spent in problem-solving sessions where students were expected to work through complex puzzles in small groups. The evenings brought group study sessions, discussions that lasted until late into the night, and endless pages of assignments that seemed impossible to complete in such a short time. Elijah tried to keep up, but it was hard. It felt like everyone else had a head start, and he was struggling to catch up. He was used to working alone, taking his time to solve problems at his own pace. But here, the clock was always ticking. The pressure to perform, to prove himself, weighed heavily on his shoulders. It wasn't just the academic challenges that were difficult. Elijah also found himself trying to navigate the social landscape of the camp. It was a world filled with talented, driven students who had been raised in environments where success was expected, where brilliance was rewarded. He couldn't help but feel like an outsider, like someone who didn't quite belong. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, Elijah found himself sitting alone on a bench by the edge of the campus. The setting sun cast long shadows across the grass, and the air was cool with the promise of nightfall. He needed a break. His mind felt like it was on overload, and the pressure to keep up was starting to break him. It was then that he noticed someone else sitting nearby, a boy around his age, looking just as out of place as Elijah felt. The boy had his head down, scribbling something in a notebook, a frown etched deeply into his face. Elijah recognized him as Ethan, a student from one of the other groups, known for his incredible talent in mathematical modeling. Like the others, Ethan exuded a quiet confidence that Elijah envied. "Hey," Elijah said, his voice uncertain. "Are you okay?" Ethan glanced up, his eyes momentarily wide before he relaxed and gave a small, tired smile. "Yeah. Just trying to keep up with everything, you know." Elijah nodded. "I get that. It's been hard." "Tell me about it," Ethan muttered, shaking his head. "I thought I had this whole thing figured out, but I'm barely holding on. I guess no one tells you how hard it's going to be when you get here. Everyone makes it look easy." Elijah sat down beside him, feeling a little less alone. "Exactly. I thought I was the only one struggling, but it's like, everyone here is a genius, and I'm just trying not to drown." Ethan let out a long sigh. "Yeah, that's about the gist of it. But hey, we're here for a reason, right? We wouldn't have gotten this far if we weren't capable of handling it." Elijah nodded, but the doubt still lingered in the back of his mind. "I don't know. I feel like everyone else here has been doing this for years. Like they were born knowing this stuff." "They might look that way," Ethan said, "but trust me, we're all figuring it out together. Some just hide it better than others." Elijah smiled weakly. "You really think so?" "I know so," Ethan said with more confidence than Elijah felt. "This isn't about being the smartest. It's about pushing yourself past your limits. And I think you've got that in you. I can tell." Those words were like a small spark of hope in the dark. Elijah had been so focused on comparing himself to others that he hadn't stopped to think about his own journey. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as far behind as he thought. Over the next few days, Elijah made a conscious effort to push aside his self-doubt. He began to take small steps toward catching up, focusing on one problem at a time, asking questions when he needed help, and leaning into the support of the camp's mentors. He was learning more than he realized, not just about math, but about himself. One afternoon, during a particularly difficult problem-solving session, Elijah found a solution to a problem that had stumped him for days. The joy that surged through him was indescribable. It wasn't just about the answer, but about proving to himself that he could do this. He could belong here. He wasn't out of his depth, he was exactly where he needed to be. When he shared his solution with the group, he noticed the approving looks from his peers. It wasn't just about the math anymore. It was about confidence, about finding his place in a world that felt overwhelming. The midweek challenge was set, a high-stakes math competition that would test everything the students had learned over the past few days. There was an energy in the air that day, a buzz of anticipation mixed with a healthy dose of anxiety. For most students, it was a familiar rhythm, another test, another opportunity to prove their worth. But for Elijah, it felt different. This wasn't just another problem to solve. This was his moment, his chance to prove that he belonged, that he was capable, that he could thrive alongside the best. For days, Elijah had been studying relentlessly. He knew that if he didn't show up for this competition, it would be a blow to his self-confidence. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to let his doubt stop him now. His heart raced as he stood in line with the other students, all of them looking calm and collected, an image that Elijah couldn't quite seem to mirror. His mind kept returning to that one thought: what if I fail? As he walked into the competition hall, the weight of the moment settled over him. The room was large, filled with rows of desks and whiteboards lined up for each team. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the soft scratching of pencils against paper and the occasional cough. Elijah took his seat at the back, his eyes scanning the room. His team consisted of himself, Emily, and Ethan, two students who had already earned a reputation as math prodigies. "You ready for this?" Emily asked him with a smile as she sat next to him. Her confidence was contagious, and for a moment, Elijah felt a small spark of hope. "I hope so," Elijah replied, adjusting his glasses. I don't want to let you guys down. Ethan, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke up. Don't worry, Elijah. We've got this. Just focus. You've been doing great. This is no different. Elijah nodded, feeling a bit reassured, though the pressure still gnawed at him. The event coordinator called for silence as the competition began, and a hush fell over the room. The first problem flashed on the screen, a challenging set of geometric proofs that required knowledge of theorems Elijah had only recently begun to understand. His heart sank. It was the kind of question that he had struggled with during study sessions. He felt a familiar sense of panic creep in. Take a deep breath, Emily said, noticing his hesitation. Remember, it's not just about solving the problem, it's about thinking through it logically. You've got this. Elijah exhaled slowly, trying to push past the anxiety. He focused on the problem in front of him, the complex diagram staring back at him like an unsolved puzzle. It would have been easy to give up, to let his fear take over, but this was the moment that would define everything. He took his pencil in hand and began to work through the steps. Slowly, carefully, he started to break down the problem. The solutions weren't immediately clear, but with each attempt, he made progress. One by one, pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Elijah glanced at Ethan, who was working with equal concentration, and then at Emily, who was writing down steps with impressive speed. He realized that he wasn't alone in this. His teammates weren't just solving problems, they were helping him see the solutions in a new light. Together, they were tackling the challenge as a team. This wasn't just a competition. It was an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to prove something to himself. After what felt like an eternity, Elijah finally put the finishing touch on the proof. He looked at it again, double-checking his work, then raised his hand to signal the team's readiness. The time had come. The next few questions were even harder than the first. Elijah could feel the pressure mounting with each new problem. As the time ticked away, the uncertainty began to creep in again. The doubts that had been buried under the adrenaline of the first problem resurfaced. What if I mess up? What if I can't keep up with the others? He watched as Emily and Ethan worked with ease, their pens moving rapidly across their pages. The sound of their scratching pencils seemed like a constant reminder of how far behind he felt. Every time he glanced at their progress, he was struck by a sense of inadequacy. He had been doing better than expected, but now, with the end of the competition in sight, the fear of failure became overwhelming. As the last question appeared on the screen, Elijah froze. It was a word problem, a complex riddle involving several advanced concepts he had only just begun to understand. The words blurred together in his mind, and for a brief moment, he lost his sense of clarity. He couldn't make sense of the problem. He could feel the pressure of the ticking clock, the eyes of his teammates on him, the weight of expectation that he had put on himself. I can't do this, Elijah whispered to himself, the panic rising in his chest. But then, something shifted. His thoughts returned to that conversation with Ethan by the bench earlier in the week. We're all figuring it out together. Some just hide it better than others. That moment of realization broke through the panic, cutting through the noise in his head. He wasn't alone in this. He wasn't expected to solve every problem perfectly on his own. He was part of a team, and together, they could figure it out. Elijah took a deep breath, forced himself to focus, and started breaking down the problem. Slowly, the pieces began to fall into place. Time was running out, but Elijah's focus was laser-sharp now. He worked through the problem, his mind buzzing with the concepts he had studied over the past week. Piece by piece, he began to fill in the gaps. The numbers and variables came together like a puzzle, and as the final seconds ticked away, Elijah felt the surge of satisfaction that only comes when everything clicks. With a quick glance at Emily and Ethan, who were looking at him expectantly, he raised his hand. We're done. The proctor collected the answers, and the students sat back in their seats, their hearts pounding. Elijah's mind was still racing, but it wasn't just from the rush of competition. He had done it. He had pushed through his doubts, worked through the pressure, and come out the other side not just with an answer, but with something much more important. The confidence that he belonged here. The results of the competition were announced later that evening. Elijah's heart pounded in his chest as the names were called out, one by one. He had tried not to get his hopes up, but as each name passed without hearing his own, a knot formed in his stomach. Had he really done enough? Finally, the last group was called, and Elijah's name was among them. Elijah stood, his hands shaking slightly as he joined his teammates. They had done it. They had won. But more than that, Elijah had proven something to himself, that he could rise to the challenge, that he was capable of more than he had ever believed. The applause of his peers echoed in his ears, but all Elijah could think about was how far he had come. From the boy who felt out of place, unsure of himself, to the student standing among the best, it had been a journey of self-discovery, and it was only just beginning. Elijah stood outside the competition hall, the echoes of applause still lingering in his ears. The weight of the day had finally started to sink in. He had done it, he had proven himself capable of achieving more than he had ever imagined. But something was missing. Despite the recognition, despite the praise, there was still a nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach, a sense that there was more to this victory than the surface success that everyone saw. As he walked to the parking lot with Emily and Ethan, his thoughts were consumed with what came next. He had reached a turning point, yes, but what was the real meaning behind this victory? Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper at play, something bigger that he had yet to grasp. "You okay?" Emily asked, glancing at him with a concerned expression. Her usual confidence had softened as she noticed his pensive silence. "Yeah, I'm good," Elijah said, forcing a smile. "It's just. I don't know. I thought winning would feel different. Like, I'd have everything figured out." Ethan, who had been unusually quiet, broke his silence. "It's funny, right? You work so hard to get to this point, and then when you actually get there, you realize it's just the beginning." The word struck Elijah like a bolt of lightning. It wasn't the first time he had heard something like that, but now, they felt true in a way they hadn't before. The competition had been a big deal, yes, but it was more about the journey to get there than the destination itself. He hadn't just proved his abilities with numbers, he had proven to himself that he could overcome his self-doubt, his fears, and the weight of expectations. But now, Elijah was starting to see that success was never just about solving the next equation, winning the next competition, or getting the approval of others. It was about something deeper, about understanding his own potential, his own worth, and what he truly wanted from life. That night, Elijah couldn't sleep. His mind raced with thoughts of the competition, the team, and everything he had learned about himself in the past few months. He was proud of his achievements, of course, but a nagging question kept swirling in his mind: what comes next? He had spent so much time chasing external validation, so focused on winning competitions and earning praise that he had lost sight of the bigger picture. Winning this competition was great, but it wasn't the end of the road. It wasn't the answer to everything. The realization hit him with the force of a tidal wave. What mattered wasn't just proving that he could do it. It was finding the reason why he wanted to do it in the first place. Elijah had been so caught up in the race to succeed, so eager to show the world that he belonged, that he hadn't taken the time to understand his own true motivations. He had always felt like he had to be the best, like he had to prove that he was just as capable as everyone else. But that thought felt hollow now. Elijah didn't need to compete for the sake of competition, he needed to learn because he loved to learn, because understanding the world through numbers, through patterns, gave him a sense of purpose. But it wasn't just about numbers. It wasn't just about winning or getting the best grades. Elijah realized that his journey was about growth. It was about using his unique talents, not to impress others, but to understand himself better, to connect with others, and to make a difference. The next morning, Elijah walked into school feeling a little lighter, as though he had shed the weight of yesterday's uncertainty. His mind was clearer now, and as he walked to his math class, he felt ready to confront his future with a renewed perspective. Mr. Lawson was already at the front of the room, writing an equation on the board as Elijah walked in. The familiar routine was comforting. Elijah had been working hard over the past weeks to impress Mr. Lawson, but today, he had a different goal in mind. Today, it wasn't about impressing anyone, it was about truly understanding. "Good morning, Mr. Lawson," Elijah said, setting his backpack down at his desk. "Morning, Elijah. You seem different today," Mr. Lawson said, raising an eyebrow. Elijah smiled faintly. "I guess I've been thinking a lot lately." Mr. Lawson nodded, sensing the change in Elijah's tone. "Care to share?" Elijah hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to express the weight of his thoughts. But something about the way Mr. Lawson looked at him, with respect, but also a quiet understanding, made him feel safe. "I've been so focused on the idea of winning, of proving something to everyone else, that I didn't stop to think about why I was doing it in the first place." Mr. Lawson leaned back in his chair. "That's a powerful realization, Elijah. A lot of people spend their whole lives chasing validation, thinking it'll bring them happiness. But real fulfillment comes from within. It's about finding purpose in what you do, not just recognition." Elijah nodded, taking in Mr. Lawson's words. They hit deeper than he expected. It was one thing to hear advice from others, but another thing entirely to feel it inside. "I think I understand now," Elijah said, his voice quiet but resolute. "It's not just about solving the problems. It's about understanding the bigger picture, learning for the sake of learning, not for anyone else's approval." "Exactly," Mr. Lawson said, his tone warm. "You've been trying to solve equations, Elijah, but the real challenge is understanding the connections between them. It's about seeing how everything fits together, not just getting the right answer." As Elijah left Mr. Lawson's class that day, he felt a shift in his mindset. It wasn't about the grades, the competitions, or the constant need to prove himself. It was about the love of learning, the joy of discovery, and the freedom that came with embracing his true passions. Elijah wasn't just solving problems to please others. He was solving them because they made sense to him, because they connected with who he was. Walking down the hallway, Elijah felt lighter than he had in a long time. He had come to understand something important: success wasn't a destination, it was the process of growth, of learning, and of becoming. And that was worth more than any competition or award. Elijah didn't know exactly where his journey would take him, but for the first time in a long while, he felt okay with that. The pressure to be perfect, to have everything figured out, had lifted. Elijah was learning to embrace the unknown, and that was the most freeing thing of all. Elijah awoke the next morning with a new sense of clarity. His mind, usually crowded with racing thoughts, felt surprisingly peaceful. He had spent weeks caught up in the whirlwind of expectations and pressure, but now he saw the world with fresh eyes. The competition was behind him, but his journey was far from over. It wasn't about the title or the recognition anymore. It was about finding purpose in everything he did, even when the road ahead seemed uncertain. As Elijah sat down at the kitchen table, his mother's warm voice broke his thoughts. "You look different today," she said with a smile, serving him his usual breakfast of pancakes and syrup. "A little lighter, maybe?" Elijah chuckled. "I guess I am." He paused, savoring the quiet moment. "It's been a weird couple of weeks, Mom. But I think I'm starting to understand what all this means." His mother raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Elijah looked down at his pancakes, trying to find the words. "I've been so focused on competing, on winning, that I never really stopped to think about why I'm doing it in the first place. It wasn't just about proving I could do something. It was about something deeper, learning for the sake of learning. And now, I finally feel like I get that." His mother smiled, her eyes softening with pride. "That's the most important thing you can realize. As long as you're learning, growing, and staying true to yourself, that's all that matters. You've come so far, Elijah. Elijah nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. I don't know what's next, Mom, but I think I'm ready for whatever comes. Later that afternoon, as Elijah walked to school, he felt a shift in his step. It wasn't just the realization of his growth, it was the knowledge that his journey was far from over. There would be new challenges, new opportunities, and even new setbacks along the way. But he was no longer afraid. He had learned that it wasn't about avoiding failure, it was about using it to grow stronger. When Elijah walked into his math class that afternoon, Mr. Lawson was already at the front, writing equations on the board. But today, something felt different. There was an energy in the room, a buzz of anticipation that Elijah hadn't felt before. Mr. Lawson looked up from his work and addressed the class. Good afternoon, everyone. I've got an exciting announcement today. There's a new opportunity coming up, a national-level math competition. It's a chance for you all to test your skills and push yourselves further. I think some of you are ready for it. Elijah's heart skipped a beat. The words, national-level competition, sent a rush of adrenaline through his veins. This was it, the next step. It was the challenge he had been waiting for, but now, it wasn't just about proving his ability to the world. It was about testing himself, pushing his limits to see how far he could go. Are you all interested? Mr. Lawson asked, his gaze sweeping across the room. It'll be tough, but I believe there are a few of you who can make a real impact. Elijah could feel the eyes of his classmates on him. Some of them looked excited, others skeptical. He knew what this would mean, the pressure, the long hours of preparation, the potential for failure. But unlike before, when the thought of competition would have filled him with anxiety, this time Elijah felt something different. He was ready. With a deep breath, Elijah raised his hand. I'm in, he said, his voice firm and confident. The words felt like a declaration, a promise to himself that he was no longer afraid of the future. Mr. Lawson smiled, nodding. That's the spirit. We'll get started on the preparations next week. But for now, just know that you've made the right choice. This is the kind of challenge that can change everything. The days that followed were a whirlwind of study sessions, late-night calculations, and intense practice. Elijah threw himself into the preparations for the national competition with a renewed sense of purpose. He had learned so much about his own abilities, but this was different. This wasn't just about solving equations or getting the right answers. It was about testing his limits, seeing how far he could push himself when the stakes were high. Every day after school, Elijah would meet with Emily and Ethan to review problems, discuss strategies, and tackle the toughest equations they could find. The team grew closer, their bond strengthened by the shared goal of success. There were moments of frustration, when they hit dead ends and couldn't figure out the solution. But there were also moments of joy, moments when everything clicked, when they solved a particularly tough problem and realized they were stronger together than apart. Elijah found himself thinking back to the lessons he had learned in recent weeks. Success wasn't about winning at all costs. It was about the journey, the process of learning, of growing, and of finding meaning in everything he did. This competition was no longer just a test of his abilities, it was a test of his character, his resilience, and his willingness to push through the challenges. But even with all the preparation, the competition loomed large in his mind. There were still doubts. Doubts about his readiness, doubts about whether he could truly measure up to the other competitors. The closer the date came, the more the pressure built. It was impossible to ignore. One evening, as Elijah sat in the library, poring over practice problems, he felt a tap on his shoulder. He looked up to see Mr. Lawson standing beside him, a thoughtful expression on his face. You've been working hard, Mr. Lawson said. But remember, it's not about being perfect. It's about doing your best. You've already proven so much to yourself. Whatever happens at the competition, you've grown immeasurably already. Elijah looked up at his teacher, a mixture of gratitude and anxiety swirling in his chest. "Thanks, Mr. Lawson. I just want to make sure I'm ready." Mr. Lawson smiled. "You're ready. You just need to trust in what you've learned." As the day of the competition approached, Elijah found himself calmer than he expected. There was still a sense of anticipation, still the nagging thought that he had something to prove, but he had also learned something important in the past few weeks. It wasn't about being the best. It was about being the best version of yourself. Elijah didn't need to win. He didn't need the title. What mattered was that he was pushing his limits, striving for excellence, and growing every single day. The competition was just another step in his journey, and this time, it wasn't the end goal. It was just the beginning. As he walked to his car, ready to head to the competition, Elijah felt a new sense of confidence. He was ready for the challenge. But more than that, he was ready for the journey ahead, whatever that might look like. The day of the national math competition arrived with an electric energy that pulsed through the air. The long weeks of preparation, the late nights spent poring over equations, the endless practice sessions, all had led to this moment. Elijah could feel the weight of it as he walked into the large auditorium where the competition would take place, his heart racing. The atmosphere was a mixture of excitement and pressure. There were students everywhere. Some chatting nervously, others pacing in focused silence, all wearing the same expression of determination. Elijah felt an odd sense of calm. The anxiety he had expected to consume him in these final moments seemed to have dissipated. He was ready. This wasn't about proving himself to others. This wasn't about standing out. This was about seeing how far he could push himself, testing everything he had learned on this grand stage. Emily and Ethan were by his side as they entered the competition hall, each of them looking equally as determined. They had come this far together, and Elijah knew that regardless of the outcome, they would leave this experience stronger. As they made their way to their assigned seats, Elijah's eyes scanned the room. There were dozens of students, but one face immediately caught his attention. At the front of the room, sitting near the front row, was a student he recognized. He had seen him in a few of the online math forums they had all been a part of over the years. His name was Alex, a mathematical prodigy from a nearby city. Alex's reputation had preceded him. He was known not just for his sharp mind, but also for his cutthroat attitude toward competition. Elijah had heard the rumors. Alex didn't just want to win, he wanted to make a statement. He was the kind of person who thrived on the idea of making others feel small in comparison. Elijah felt an odd tension building in his chest. He had heard about Alex's genius, but seeing him in person was another thing altogether. The student had an almost intimidating presence, his sharp eyes scanning the room with a certain kind of arrogance, a smirk on his face as if he already knew he would come out on top. Elijah's instincts told him this was the kind of rival who could easily rattle him. But he wasn't going to let that happen. He straightened his shoulders and took a deep breath. This was about him, not about Alex or anyone else in the room. He would do his best, and that was enough. The competition began with a buzz of activity as the first round started. Elijah focused all of his attention on the problems in front of him. The first few questions were tough, but he was ready. He moved through them with a steady hand, his mind working at full capacity. His teammates, Emily and Ethan, were equally focused, and they exchanged occasional glances of encouragement, knowing that the road ahead was only going to get harder. But in the midst of all of this, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that Alex's eyes were on him. Every time he glanced up, he would see Alex staring at him, that same smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. It was as though Alex was silently daring him to make a mistake, to fall short. Elijah's jaw tightened. He wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. As the rounds went on, the questions grew more complex, the challenges more daunting. Elijah could feel the weight of the competition bearing down on him. This wasn't just about formulas and equations anymore. It was about mental endurance, about holding on when the pressure threatened to overwhelm him. He had faced moments like this before, but this time felt different. The competition was intense, the stakes high. And with Alex lurking nearby, it felt even more personal. In the middle of a particularly challenging round, Elijah hit a wall. His mind, which had been racing through problems with ease just moments ago, suddenly went blank. He stared at the equation in front of him, the numbers blurring on the page. The pressure was mounting, the clock ticking down, and he couldn't find a way forward. He felt the familiar pang of frustration and self-doubt creep in. It was then that he heard it. A sharp laugh, loud enough to cut through the quiet murmur of the room. Elijah glanced up, and there was Alex, his eyes gleaming with a sense of superiority. He had just solved the question in record time and was now looking around the room, his gaze landing on Elijah with an almost mocking stare. The laugh was meant for Elijah, a reminder that Alex was here to win, and he wasn't worried about anyone else. Elijah's heart skipped a beat. That moment of doubt threatened to pull him under. He had to shake it off. He couldn't let Alex get to him. The only thing that mattered was the problem in front of him, the equations he needed to solve. Nothing else. Taking a deep breath, Elijah closed his eyes for a second, centering himself. He could feel his mind spinning, but he forced himself to focus. What had he learned over the past few months? What had Mr. Lawson, Emily, and Ethan taught him? It wasn't about being perfect. It was about embracing the challenge, staying calm, and using what he knew to solve the problem, no matter how tough it was. With that thought, the answer appeared. It wasn't a flash of brilliance. It wasn't a moment of pure genius. It was simply the product of everything he had worked for, the process of thinking clearly, step by step, and trusting his own abilities. He solved the equation. A smile tugged at the corner of Elijah's mouth as he filled in the last step. He didn't know if it would be enough to keep him in the lead, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that he had pushed through the doubt and solved the problem. He had trusted himself. But the road wasn't over yet. The competition continued to intensify, with each round more difficult than the last. Elijah found himself running on pure determination now. The fight wasn't just about the numbers, it was about proving to himself that he could stand his ground, no matter who was watching or who was challenging him. As the final round approached, Elijah couldn't ignore the weight of Alex's presence any longer. The smug expression on Alex's face had never faded, and Elijah could tell that Alex was just as determined to win. But now, Elijah had something he hadn't had before: resolve. He wasn't just competing against Alex anymore. He was competing against his own fears, his doubts, and his past failures. The real enemy wasn't the person sitting across from him. It was the voice in his head telling him he wasn't good enough. The last round was brutal. The problems came at them faster than ever, and Elijah felt the pressure building with every passing minute. He couldn't stop thinking about how close the end was. But amidst the chaos, Elijah kept reminding himself that he was ready for this. He had fought hard to get here, and now, he wasn't backing down. The air in the competition hall was thick with tension. As Elijah sat at his desk, surrounded by his teammates, the final round of the national math competition began. The room was silent except for the sound of pencils scratching against paper and the faint clicking of the timer counting down. Elijah's mind raced, but he forced himself to focus. This was the moment. The moment he had worked for, bled for, struggled for. He could hear the clock ticking in his ears, its rhythmic beat matching the thumping of his heart. He glanced around the room, noting the quiet intensity of his fellow competitors. His gaze briefly met Alex's across the room. Alex's face was set in an impassive mask, his eyes sharp and focused on his own paper, but Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that Alex knew exactly what was at stake for him. Alex didn't just want to win, he wanted to break everyone around him. Elijah had to remind himself that it didn't matter. He wasn't here to fight Alex. He was here to prove something to himself. The first problem was a tough one, a complex series of algebraic equations and abstract functions. Elijah immediately recognized the challenge but found himself more at ease than he had expected. The nerves that had once paralyzed him in moments like this had faded. Instead of feeling overwhelmed by the complexity, he embraced it, allowing his mind to work through each step with precision. Time ticked by, each second another small eternity as he moved from one question to the next. He could feel the weight of the competition, but it was no longer oppressive. He was in the zone. Elijah solved each problem, letting the numbers and symbols take shape in his mind. They weren't just equations anymore, they were the manifestation of all his hard work, all the nights spent in his room, all the struggles he had faced along the way. But then came the final problem. Elijah's pen paused as he read through it. His breath caught for a moment. The question was deceptively simple at first glance, but Elijah knew better. It was a trap. There were multiple layers to it, hidden beneath the surface of the seemingly easy wording. His heart raced as he deciphered the problem, breaking it down step by step. This wasn't just about mathematical skill, this was about intuition. It was about trusting his gut and his instincts, the things he had worked to develop over the months. He tried one approach. It didn't work. He recalculated, trying a different path. Again, the numbers didn't align. Panic threatened to creep in, but Elijah refused to let it. He had come too far. He had fought too hard to let this moment slip away. His fingers tightened around the pen as he steeled himself for the final push. He closed his eyes for a brief second, centering himself. This was it. The culmination of everything. He wasn't just solving a problem. He was proving to himself that he was capable of achieving greatness. That he could be more than the kid who had once been laughed at, who had struggled to find his place. This was his moment. With renewed clarity, Elijah took a breath, cracked his knuckles, and began writing. The numbers flowed, the solution unraveling before his eyes. Each calculation brought him closer to the answer, and the doubts that had once plagued him now seemed distant, almost irrelevant. He filled in the final step, completing the equation. Elijah looked at his work, the solution in front of him. He felt a swell of pride in his chest, a quiet satisfaction that came from knowing he had given everything he had. He had solved it. But there was still Alex. Elijah turned his head, his eyes seeking out the rival who had dominated his thoughts throughout the competition. Alex was still hunched over his paper, his face unreadable, but Elijah could sense the same quiet intensity coming from him. Alex was finishing his problem, and it was clear from the tension in his posture that he was just as determined to win as Elijah. The timer ticked down to its final seconds. Elijah's pulse quickened, and as he handed in his paper, a sense of finality washed over him. He had done his best. The outcome was out of his hands now. The weight of the competition lifted from his shoulders, leaving behind only the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had fought until the very end. The room quieted, the air thick with anticipation. Elijah sat in his seat, his palms sweating slightly, his mind racing. He exchanged glances with Emily and Ethan, both of them equally tense. None of them knew what the result would be, but all three of them knew that they had given it everything. The only thing left was to wait. After what seemed like an eternity, the announcer stepped up to the microphone, his voice echoing across the room. Ladies and gentlemen, the results are in. Thank you all for your hard work and dedication. The winners of the 2025 National Math Competition are. Elijah's breath caught in his throat. He could barely hear the announcer's words over the pounding in his chest. This was the moment. This was the culmination of everything he had worked for. The tension in the air was palpable, and the audience, silent in anticipation, leaned forward. The winners of the 2025 National Math Competition are Elijah Taylor, Emily Thompson, and Ethan Carter. Elijah's heart nearly stopped. He blinked, disbelief flashing across his face. It was his name. His team's name. They had won. He had won. A slow, incredulous smile spread across Elijah's face as the crowd erupted into applause. His teammates were already on their feet, their faces lit up with shock and joy. Emily and Ethan grabbed him in a tight hug, laughing, unable to contain their excitement. But for Elijah, it was like everything around him fell away. The cheers, the flashing lights, the roar of the crowd, it all became background noise as he took in the sheer magnitude of what had just happened. He had done it. For the first time in his life, he felt the weight of his journey come to fruition. All the doubts, all the insecurities, all the moments when he had wondered if he was enough, they had all led to this. As Elijah stood on the podium, accepting his gold medal with Emily and Ethan, he realized that the competition had never really been about the victory itself. It had been about the journey. The long nights of study. The failures, the frustrations. The belief that even when things seemed impossible, he could push through and find a way forward. And, perhaps most importantly, it had been about the people who had believed in him, people like Mr. Lawson, who had seen something in him when others hadn't. It had been about the friendships he had formed, the support he had found, and the lessons he had learned about perseverance and self-worth. As the crowd cheered and the confetti rained down on them, Elijah glanced over at Alex, who was standing a few feet away. Alex's face was stoic, his jaw clenched in a mixture of frustration and admiration. But Elijah didn't feel triumph over him. Instead, he felt gratitude. Gratitude for the challenge that had pushed him to be better. And gratitude for the growth that had come from competing against someone who had pushed him to his limits. This was just the beginning. Elijah had learned something far more valuable than any trophy. He had learned the power of believing in himself, of rising above the voices of doubt. He had learned that no matter the challenge, no matter the competition, he had what it took to succeed, and that was enough. With a smile on his face, Elijah turned to Emily and Ethan, and together, they walked off the stage, knowing that the journey was far from over. The real competition had just begun, and Elijah was ready to face whatever came next. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?